Anyway, so I am doing a talk on the African-American experience in Chicago. I'm mostly focusing on sort of the fun period from the 40s to the 70s, but unfortunately you need a sort of long background before any of that really makes any sense. So I'm going to just do a quick run-up from the Civil War because I'm guessing you're all familiar with the outlines of sort of what happened to African Americans during Emancipation. But essentially, end of the Civil War, the slaves have been freed, all of them. They're still living in incredibly crappy conditions. Many of them are sort of in virtual slavery again, where they're in eternal debt to their landlords as sharecroppers, and they aren't actually making any monetary profit. 95% of all of the African Americans in the country live in the South. There's almost none in urban city centers. This remains the case until about 1910, during the first Great Migration. There's a lot of reasons that the first Great Migration sort of comes about. Some of the big ones are fairly obvious. The South is incredibly racist. It's during the second highest peak in Klan murders, other than immediately after the Civil War is over. So there's a lot of violence there. It's also during a drought year, or not a drought, there's some kind of disease in the cotton. The cotton harvest is really bad, so a lot of sharecroppers are going bust, they can't make it in the South, and they start taking the trains, which have finally sort of gotten into circulation up to the urban city centers. Once they get there, they sort of establish themselves as what will later become known as sort of the old settlers in Chicago. And they're the first wave of migrants. They sort of set the tone for everyone else's immigration into the city. The first Great Migration is usually held to go for about 20, 30 years. It's sort of a mushy time period. Some people don't actually bother to break it up into first and second Great Migrations. But there's a wide culture difference between the first people to come and the second people. The first people to come end up setting up things like the Urban League, sort of groups that are designed to help African Americans adjust to city life and to a very different northern experience of racism. Because southern racism is sort of, it's the one everyone is most familiar with. It's Jim Crow, it's sort of very cartoonish and kind of vicious. In the North, it tends to be kind of a racism of non-involvement. Northern racism consisted of not wanting to have anything to do with African Americans, basically, because they sort of, a lot of the northern motivations in some ways for being anti-slavery weren't quite as moralistic as we'd like them to be, at least by our standards. A lot of them felt that slavery was sort of degrading to white people as much as to black people because it made them depend on other people's labor, and it made them sort of not hardworking, and it made them sort of like do bad things to other people even if they didn't see those people as equals. So they mostly wanted African Americans to go away. That's why the whole ridiculous colonization back to Africa thing lasted for so long, is because those who were both pro and anti-slavery they didn't know what to do with African Americans. They couldn't really make a place for them mentally. So anyway, the first set of the migrants gets to Chicago. They begin to sort of establish themselves. It helps that the 1924 Immigration Act basically cut off immigration from Europe. All of the cheap factory labor that they've been using is gone, and factories are running short of people, and the First World War means that there's a lot more industrialization, there's a lot more need for workers, and there's a lot fewer people. So all of that happens, and somewhere around, let me check my date on this, somewhere around 1894, there's the Pullman Porter strike. The Pullman Porters are the guys who basically run the trains. They're sort of the manservant, all-purpose workers and the trains that were connecting the North to the South. And during this strike, African Americans were hired by the company as scabs to break the strikes. And eventually, basically, the Pullman Porters actually became an all-black organization, and one that was very important, actually. They were one of the first unionized, organized sort of African American groups in the city, and they actually had a big effect on sort of the second half of the Great Migration. The Defender newspaper was started in 1905. It's certainly the first African American newspaper in Chicago, possibly close to being the first in the U.S. I don't think it actually is the first, but it's certainly one of the most influential and prominent. And the Pullman Porters are part of the reason that it mattered so much, because they would take copies of the Defender South when they went on southward train trips, and they would sell them, give them out, pass them around, and the circulation for the paper was unbelievably wide in the South, actually. And for every one person who bought it, like 10 people would read it. Like, it would get passed around the entire community. And its editor, Robert Abbott, was very pro-migration. He sort of thought that African Americans would only really find equality and sort of decent treatment in America in the North. So he would post a lot of stories of how much better the money was, how much less racism there was, like open work positions that were there, stories from people who had migrated and had a great time. And African Americans started going in droves. It's actually very interesting, but I won't go through it in too much detail, sort of the process by which people made their way north, because the Southerners actually really wanted to keep them in the South. They had no one to do the work without them, and often, they had trouble getting train tickets, people would steal their money, people would try to, repossess their things to keep them from leaving, but people kept coming. They sort of would come in big migration clubs, a lot of them, or they'd be recruited by labor sort of headhunters, I guess, from the North, who needed a lot of manpower for the factories. So by about, and I should mention that by 1919, there was enough of an African-American presence in the city that the 1919 race riots, which you've probably heard of, were incredibly devastating. Again, I won't go into huge detail about it, but basically what happened was a teenager on one of the beaches along Lakeshore sort of drifted over the invisible line of white half, black half, and was stoned to death by the white people on the beach. Naturally, all of the African Americans rioted, and the whites rioted back, and basically gangs of both races sort of ran wild in the city for a while. There weren't too many deaths, there were a lot of injuries, and they were just hurting random people who weren't involved, they were pulling people off streetcars, both sides of the fight were, it was pretty disastrous, and there were forces like the Urban League sort of put a lot of effort into trying to prevent incidents like this. They would put out sort of pamphlets for the new migrants from the South, telling them how to behave, what to worry about, where to live, how not to seem, because they were also very worried about seeming ignorant, and all of these poor, uneducated sharecroppers were coming up from the South, and they were putting a lot of effort into trying to make them not sort of fulfill the stereotypes they saw in African American life, and there was a lot of tension in the black community because of this, because the first beginnings of sort of a class structure within the black community were really coming about then. Because another thing is, in Chicago, segregation was pretty absolute, but not exactly in the way it was in the South, though. In the South, the social segregation was total in terms of water fountains and where you lived and how you were treated, but people sort of lived in the same place. In Chicago, that really wasn't the case. There's a big sign near the Dan Ryan, actually, that's still there. It says Bronzeville, and that was basically the name for the African American ghetto. Now, this ghetto is very different from a lot of the associations we have with the word ghetto today. I'm trying to remember there's a sort of, I think the technical name is an institutional ghetto versus I forget the other term for ghetto, but there's a specific type of ghetto that is sort of treated very differently than most of our associations would be. Basically, Bronzeville was a city within the city at large. They had their own banking system, their own entertainment houses, their own stores. They had an entire separate copy of Chicago on the South Side. There was one of the first black entrepreneurs, in fact, named Jesse Binga, started the first sort of tycoonship, I guess, economic tycoonship on the South Side. He started this thing called the Binga Arcade, which was this big, I guess we call it a sort of mall, multiplex, if such a thing existed. It had lots of entertainment stores. He had the only bank here, stuff like that. But basically, there existed within Bronzeville, eventually, all of the layers, social layers that you'd expect to see sort of in the rest of the city at large. They had, in fact, I think this would be a good time to introduce the study. Around